The global monetary order did not unravel because it failed. It unraveled because it was enforced. For decades, the world was told that the dominance of one currency was the natural outcome of trust, stability, and economic strength. But what happens when a country is removed by force for pricing its oil differently? What happens when currency choice is treated as a security threat? In January 2026, that question stopped being theoretical. The system revealed its mechanism, its boundary, and its fear. This is not a forecast of collapse. This is the moment the structure exposed itself. And once that happens, the end is no longer avoidable. Before the world saw Venezuela as a crisis, it was a cornerstone of the modern energy economy. Long before sanctions, shortages, and hyperinflation, the country occupied a central position inside the global monetary order built after the Second World War. Venezuela's oil reserves were identified in the early 20th century, but their true strategic value emerged decades later. By the 1970s, Venezuela had become one of the founding members of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries and one of the largest crude exporters in the world. Its oil flowed primarily to the United States, where refineries in Texas and Louisiana depended on Venezuelan heavy crude. This trade was not merely commercial, it was monetary. Every barrel was priced and settled in United States dollars. Those dollars did not remain in Venezuela. They were recycled back into the United States through imports, weapons purchases, and United States Treasury bonds. The same currency used to buy oil returned as financing for American debt. This loop was the foundation of the petrodollar system. Oil created permanent global demand for dollars. That demand allowed the United States to run deficits without facing immediate currency collapse. As long as energy trade required dollars, the system appeared stable. Time, 0.3s, neutral, and voluntary. Participation carried benefits. Oil exporters gained access to capital markets, financial infrastructure, and implicit security guarantees. Exit carried consequences. But for decades, exit was hypothetical. Venezuelan governments before the turn of the century accepted the arrangement. The system worked as long as oil remained dollar-denominated and reserves stayed inside the dollar framework. This was not enforced daily. It did not need to be. Its power came from the assumption that no serious producer would ever challenge it. That assumption ended in 1999. Time 05s. The challenge did not begin as a confrontation with the United States. It began as a question about sovereignty. When Hugo Chavez assumed the presidency in 1999, he inherited a country rich in resources but constrained by its position inside a system it did not control. To Chavez, Venezuela's oil was not simply a commodity. It was leverage that had been surrendered through habit rather than necessity. He questioned why the world's largest proven oil reserves were bound to a single settlement currency, why revenue flowed outward while monetary power remained concentrated elsewhere, why access to markets depended on submission to a financial architecture designed beyond Venezuela's border. Time, 0.5s. The first steps were cautious but symbolic. In 2000, Chavez visited Iraq during the sanctions era and announced oil for goods exchanges. These transactions were small, but their meaning was not. They bypassed dollar settlement entirely. What followed was structural change. New hydrocarbons legislation transferred majority control of oil projects to the Venezuelan state. Foreign corporations were forced to cede ownership or withdraw. Long-term agreements with China replaced dollar financing with infrastructure investment repaid in oil. Subsidized shipments to Cuba were exchanged for doctors and teachers rather than currency. Each decision reduced exposure to the dollar system. None of them were isolated. Together, they formed a coherent strategy. By 2008, Chavez was openly advocating the creation of a world beyond dollar dominance. He proposed regional currencies, expanded cooperation with China, the Russian Federation, and Iran, and framed the petrodollar as a tool of external control. For the first time in decades, the system faced a visible and persistent challenger. The response was measured at first. Systems built on long-term dominance rarely react to initial defiance with force. They observe, test limits, and apply pressure indirectly. As Venezuela moved from rhetoric to construction, the reaction shifted. Withdrawal from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank severed formal channels of financial influence. Public calls for a new reserve currency challenged the legitimacy of the existing monetary order itself. These moves were not ignored. They were catalogued. Direct intervention was unnecessary in the early years. Other instruments were available. In 2002, an attempted coup briefly removed Hugo Chavez from power. Although official denials followed, later disclosures confirmed external support for the effort. Within 48 hours, the coup collapsed. Chavez returned, strengthened rather than weakened. Political pressure followed. A recall referendum in 2004 was backed by extensive funding, media campaigns, and international support for the opposition. It failed. Chavez secured nearly 60% of the vote. When leadership could not be removed through political means, strategy shifted again. Economic pressure replaced electoral maneuvering. Sanctions, capital restrictions, and financial isolation were introduced incrementally, shaping long-term vulnerability rather than immediate collapse. The objectives did not change. Only the timeline did. When Hugo Chavez died in 2013, the structure he had built did not disappear. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, inherited a country already positioned outside the dollar system and a confrontation that had not been resolved. The system had waited. Now it would tighten. Under Nicolas Maduro, the direction did not soften. It became irreversible. While international attention shifted toward governance and legitimacy, the financial trajectory remained unchanged. Venezuela continued to reduce its reliance on the United States dollar while deepening economic ties with China and the Russian Federation. This persistence triggered a transition from pressure to containment. In 2015, the United States formally declared Venezuela a national security threat. Targeted sanctions followed, marking the opening phase of coordinated financial warfare. 2 years later, those measures expanded dramatically. United States companies were barred from purchasing Venezuelan oil. Hundreds of thousands of barrels per day lost their primary customer overnight. Dollar-denominated assets held abroad were frozen, cutting off access to Venezuela's own reserves. Shipping insurance, financial services, and oil equipment exports were restricted, dismantling the operational foundation of the energy sector. The effects were structural, not accidental. Venezuela's oil infrastructure depended on United States technology. Without spare parts and technical support, production collapsed. Revenue disappeared. Hyperinflation followed. Time 0.3s, reaching levels measured in millions of percent. Public explanations framed these measures as defense of democracy and human rights. Comparison revealed a different logic. States with worse records faced no comparable punishment as long as their oil remained dollar-denominated. The pattern was consistent. Compliance preserved access. Deviation triggered isolation. By the late 2010s, Venezuela had crossed a point of no return. Returning to the dollar system would not restore access. It would only restore vulnerability. From that moment forward, adaptation replaced retreat. Once, retreat was no longer an option. Venezuela shifted from survival to redesign. If exclusion from the dollar system was permanent, then dependence on it was a liability, not a safeguard. From 2017 onward, oil exports were rerouted deliberately. China became the primary buyer, with transactions settled in yuan rather than United States dollars. India followed, purchasing crude in rupees under arrangements that bypassed Western financial channels. With the Russian Federation, exchanges moved even further from conventional currency, relying on direct barter of oil for food, machinery, and military equipment. Parallel mechanisms developed with Iran, Cuba, and Nicaragua. Bilateral clearing systems allowed trade without touching dollar-based settlement networks. Debt owed to China from earlier infrastructure loans was repaid in oil shipments instead of cash, converting financial obligations into physical flows. Each channel reduced exposure to sanctions. Together, they formed an alternative architecture. By 2025, approximately 900,000 barrels per day were being sold through non-dollar arrangements. At prevailing prices, this represented tens of billions of dollars in annual energy trade, no longer reinforcing United States monetary dominance. This was not an isolated experiment. The Russian Federation was selling millions of barrels per day outside the dollar system. Iran had done the same for years. Even long-standing partners of the United States were exploring partial diversification. Non-dollar oil trade was no longer marginal. It was measurable, coordinated, and accelerating. The petrodollar was not eroding slowly. It was being replaced incrementally. The shift became irreversible when temporary workarounds turned into long-term commitments. In late 2025, Venezuela and China announced an agreement that went far beyond oil sales. China committed tens of billions of dollars to rebuild Venezuela's oil infrastructure. Refineries, pipelines, ports, and production facilities would be restored and expanded over multiple years. In return, Venezuela would supply more than 1 million barrels per day to China, with every transaction settled in yuan. This was not a circumvention of sanctions. It was a structural realignment. For the first time, the largest proven oil reserves on Earth were being permanently integrated into a non-dollar financial system. The agreement locked future energy flows outside the dollar framework for decades, not quarters. At that moment, the strategic risk changed. If Venezuela succeeded, the precedent would not remain isolated. Other exporters, already experimenting with diversification, would follow. Saudi Arabia was negotiating partial yuan settlement. Non-dollar oil trade had reached a scale that could no longer be contained quietly. Allowing the agreement to proceed meant accepting the erosion of enforcement. The response came swiftly. On January 3rd, 2026, United States Special Operations Forces entered Caracas in a publicly acknowledged military operation. The sitting president, Nicolas Maduro, was detained, removed from office, and transported out of the country. The justification was law enforcement. The execution was military. Within days, a new government announced the restoration of dollar-denominated oil contracts. The China agreement was suspended. Venezuela was forced back into the petrodollar system. But the method revealed something the system could not undo. The international response clarified what the operation had achieved and what it had irreversibly damaged. China condemned the action as an illegal invasion and suspended diplomatic engagement with the United States. The Russian Federation called an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council. 14 members supported a resolution condemning the operation. Only one opposed it. Even long-standing allies avoided full alignment. In the United Nations General Assembly, a large majority of countries voted to denounce the violation of sovereignty. These resolutions did not change control on the ground, but they reshaped perception. This was not interpreted as the enforcement of law. It was interpreted as the enforcement of a monetary order. Markets responded faster than governments. Oil prices surged within days, not because supply had been interrupted, but because risk had been redefined. Every oil-producing state now faced a new calculation. Currency choice was no longer a technical decision. It was a security decision. The expected reaction did not occur. The United States dollar did not strengthen. Instead, the yuan appreciated. Non-dollar settlement accelerated as countries reassessed exposure to a system that punished exits with force. The operation was intended to restore confidence. It produced fear, and fear does not reinforce monetary dominance. It accelerates escape. From that moment forward, the petrodollar was no longer perceived as neutral infrastructure. It was perceived as geopolitical exposure. What followed was not immediate collapse, but quiet recalibration. The most consequential shifts did not appear in speeches or headlines. They appeared in contracts, reserve allocations, and settlement clauses rewritten behind closed doors. Oil exporters did not announce departures from the dollar system. They diversified incrementally. Payment windows shortened. Currency baskets replaced single currency exposure. Barter mechanisms and bilateral clearing arrangements, once considered marginal, were normalized as strategic safeguards. The logic was no longer ideological. It was defensive. A system maintained by confidence can absorb dissent. A system maintained by force cannot. Once participation becomes compulsory, permanence disappears. China's role was not to replace the dollar everywhere. It was to make exit survivable. Through infrastructure financing, alternative payment systems, long-term energy contracts, and security coordination, a parallel framework took shape. It did not require trust in United States enforcement, only participation. Central banks responded accordingly. Reserve diversification accelerated in small increments that compounded over time. Energy importing states mirrored the logic from the opposite side, reducing exposure to a currency whose use could trigger political risk. This was not rebellion, it was hedging. And hedges, once adopted, are rarely reversed. The system continued to function, but its center of gravity had shifted. By the time those adjustments became visible, the structural balance had already changed. What once appeared as isolated diversification was becoming coordinated behavior. Energy exporters compared frameworks, not alliances. What mattered was not political alignment, but optionality. The capacity to settle trade without triggering retaliation became a strategic requirement. This is where the petrodollar lost its defining advantage. For decades, it functioned as a default. It did not need defense because there was no alternative with scale, liquidity, and protection. After January 3rd, 2026, that assumption no longer held. China's role was not ideological opposition. It was infrastructural substitution. Payment rails, development banks, long-term commodity contracts, and security coordination formed a parallel channel that reduced dependence on United States enforcement. Once that channel existed, remaining fully inside the dollar system no longer minimized risk. It concentrated it. This is how reserve systems decline. Not through sudden abandonment, but through redistribution of exposure. Each adjustment appears minor in isolation. Together, they become irreversible. The petrodollar did not weaken because it was challenged. It weakened because its response revealed the limits of voluntary participation. The final phase was not announced. It was absorbed. Once markets, governments, and central banks accepted that enforcement had replaced consent, the remaining logic collapsed on its own. A reserve system sustained by fear cannot rely on permanence. It relies on delay. For decades, the United States benefited from a closed loop. Oil priced in dollars generated global demand. That demand financed debt, consumption, and military reach without immediate constraint. When the loop weakened, the cost did not disappear. It moved inward. Energy prices transmitted through supply chains. Import costs rose as currency dominance softened. Monetary policy lost flexibility as inflation and debt limited response. The privileges of reserve status eroded faster than the obligations attached to it. What replaced the old order was not a single challenger. It was fragmentation, multiple settlement systems, multiple reserve currencies, multiple security guarantees. The petrodollar did not end because Venezuela was invaded. It ended because the invasion demonstrated that the system no longer functioned on trust. That moment will not be remembered for the operation itself. It will be remembered for what it revealed. Eighth, currency system enforced by force is already in decline. Once that truth becomes visible, the transition cannot be reversed. Ban. Komwon toi tiep tuk fan tiep theo hong. The story does not end with resolution. It ends with exposure. For half a century, the dominance of the United States dollar rested on a belief that it was indispensable, liquid, neutral, accepted everywhere because it worked better than the alternatives. That belief allowed the system to operate without constant enforcement. January 3rd, 2026 changed that perception permanently. In one act, the mechanism was revealed. Leaving the dollar system was no longer treated as a market decision. It was treated as a security threat. From that moment forward, participation became conditional, and conditional systems do not inspire long-term loyalty. Countries did not abandon the dollar overnight. They adjusted, they diversified, they prepared, because once the cost of exit is known, the incentive shifts from commitment to timing. This is how monetary orders end. Not with collapse in a single moment, but with recognition. Recognition that the rules have changed. Recognition that dominance is being preserved by force rather than function. The invasion of Venezuela will not be remembered as a successful enforcement action. It will be studied as a case example, a demonstration of how a system reveals its own fragility when it can no longer rely on consent. The petrodollar era did not end because Venezuela was important. It ended because the world learned what happens when a country tries to leave. And once that lesson is learned, the system's fate is sealed. Ilum.